Today I'm here to talk for just a couple of minutes about what we call limited access files. Earlier this year I received some inquiries regarding these files. Specifically, when I talk about a limited access file, it refers to files that are intended to limit internal access for sensitive case information. And as a result of the inquiries I received, I asked our City Attorney Jennifer Magana to perform a review of our current policies and practices, and also to develop some recommendations for going forward so we can bring some clarity to the issue. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Jennifer. She's going to summarize her findings and recommendations, and then at the end of that, we'll be glad to answer questions.
Good morning. I have completed review of the Wichita Police Department's limited access database and prepared a report for the city manager. I'll briefly review the main points of that report and then be available for questions. The main points were the record systems themselves, how the records are maintained, what is in the files themselves, third, the findings the report contains, and fourth, the management recommendations. So briefly, the records in question, what have been informally referred to as confidential files. That's really a misnomer in terms of title. It's been used informally, but that's what staff has recommended, has over the years used. Those files reside in the city's document storage system called Laserfish. This system is used by multiple city departments. Within the WPD's files, once paper or other investigative records are created to support a case, those files are scanned, documents are scanned and placed into Laserfish. If they are designated as a quote-unquote confidential file by police supervisors, those records clerks will then submit them to the appropriate database. In those cases then, of those in Laserfish, there are three categories that have limited access. They're homicides, they're vehicular fatalities, and they're general confidential records. In Laserfish itself, over 800 of city police department employees have access. For these three categories, 92 people have access. Those categories in which 92 people have access, there are 5 different agencies. There are Wichita Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, DA's office, City Law Department, and an employee in the City Manager's office who have access to those records. A case is designated for these files when a supervisor requests it based on the facts of the case. The clerk will then, as I said, enter it into the appropriate database, and the paper files are also maintained as are other records in the Police Department Records Department. The intent and the result of this practice is to limit access from the over 800 Wichita Police Department employees to only those individuals with a business need for access, because these cases are the type that may invite curiosity or inquiry. This practice does not limit external access to these records for purposes of the Kansas Open Record Act, for the criminal or civil discovery process, or for their court-ordered production. This practice is consistent with what I observe that other organizations do and handle with sensitive records like financial records or medical records or personnel records. There is a limited access based on a business need to know, and that's consistent with what I found. So in terms of the files themselves, for the general database, not counting the homicide or the vehicular fatality cases, we found in each year going back until about the late 80s, there are anywhere from about a dozen to about 30 or so cases per year in those. Within those cases, there are a variety of cases ranging from misdemeanors or just miscellaneous reports to suicides, sex offenses, crimes against children, and just a variety of sensitive type of cases. And every year there are a number of cases involving Wichita Police Department or city employees as victims or suspects or witnesses. Occasionally there is what would be considered a high-profile individual as a victim or a suspect or a witness. So what I did find was that these cases are comprehensively and fully investigated in the same manner in which all other cases are investigated. I find that this practice does not violate any law or policy, and I recommend that the WPD continue to use this model. After reviewing, I did find a couple issues that are not directly tied to the confidential file designation, but did catch our attention. There were a few cases in which suspect was listed as known adult suspect or known suspect. That's just not consistent with WPD protocol, and it's my understanding that they will take steps to correct these anomalies. There was another discovery that in the reporting software that extracts cases for the daily briefing, not every case was being extracted based on the date that a case was cut or formalized. So it's my understanding that fix was made a couple months ago. Finally, my report does contain some management recommendations to clarify and document the process. The first recommendation is that the police department should continue the process, if it desires to limit access to certain files through the use of the limited access database in the city's Laserfish system. Second would be that the department create a written policy governing the use of this practice. That policy should contain a stated business purpose, a stated need for the database, a change of name to reflect accurately what it is, a limited access database. It should also identify those folks who are systems administrators, who have access, who manage the database, who determine who has access. It should also identify those folks who have access to make designations as to what should be in this file. I'd further recommend that the system have annual audit requirements and any other controls that are necessary to ensure that the police department comply with the state and KBI regulations as far as law enforcement records. I'd recommend that WPD look at any other provisions they may deem appropriate and incorporate those into a policy. Further, I'd recommend that the police department just inform the department and all staff why the policy exists and publish it in the manner that it's been published, that other policies have been published. And finally, that the department should just maintain the fix that's been made into the reporting software so that all reports are extracted daily, and that I believe has been accomplished. So that's the summary of my report, and I'm available for questions if you have any.
If you've got an audit that's being recommended, why not just do it quarterly if it's going to be free of charge by another agency?
Quarterly, I would have no objection to that. It sounds like a sound business practice.
And regarding the CORA, we're still compliant with CORA with what you're recommending. Could you explain a little more in detail why you feel we are compliant with CORA at this point? And where's the accountability to show that we are?
Mm-hmm. The CORA requests are supervised by the law department. When the city receives one to every department, we work with the department. Those records are maintained both digitally and in paper. So there's a couple places there. We have access. We had access prior to my investigation through in the limited access database. So there are a couple different layers of access. We take a consistent position that the CORA should be complied with, and we believe that has been accomplished.
What was your baseline from working? What's your experience on something like this? Have you done this before?
Nothing quite like this. Just had a unique experience in reviewing a lot of police reports. In terms of the number, it was a large number.
When exactly was the review completed?
The report was completed, I believe, last week.
Do you have a specific day or?
I do not.
So Jennifer, as far as high-profile city employees or police department employees, so we still at this point we won't know if one's being considered a victim or a suspect in a crime.
Those records are subject to the open records request, and those requests can be made and acted upon at any time.
So they will be subject. So
the records are certainly subject to any request at any time.
Okay. And this limited access file, you mentioned since the late 80s, that's when it went into place. And I guess what I'm wondering is why was this never made public? Why did the public know there was this limited access file?
Again, it was a matter of administrative internal process. It's really more of a process issue internally than externally. It's a system in which the police department manages its records, so I believe it developed over time and from one person to another. That would probably be the explanation.
And on the unknown adult suspect, how concerning is that was in some of these cases?
I believe it was so rarely done. It was not a systematic approach to raise concern that there was an approach that was taken. I believe it was rare. So as long as it's being addressed, I think that's what's important.
And did you find out why that was used in the few cases?
I did not. That extended past the scope of this review. I brought that to the attention of the police department.
At this point, do you know, and this might be more of a police department question, if there will be any repercussions, punishments for some of these things, like using the non-adult enforcement?
I do not.
Jennifer, did any of the 92 people who had access to these cases also have the authority to, if they were part of the investigation or one of the city employees involved, like a suspect or victim, did any of those people have the authority to put themselves into this limited access file?
I do not know that answer. I believe that would require a records supervisor or records captain to make that designation. So individually, I believe it would take their request to the records section.
And to kind of follow up on that, does anyone from the law department specifically have the authority to put these records into this limited access file, or do they just have the authority to view them?
Now, the law department does not participate in making those designations.
Jennifer, I know you talked briefly about this, but why is it so important to have this file?
I think it's important for the police department and a prudent business practice to limit the access because, as we said, there are over 800 employees who do not all have a business need to know every type of sensitive case. And when you limit the access to those people with only a business need to know, you also limit the opportunity for an improper or an unlawful or illegal disclosure of a law enforcement record. So I think it's a business practice that should be maintained for that purpose. It recognizes that there is a curiosity about certain types of cases, and in fact there has been improper disclosures in past years. So it's a practice to stem that.
You also heard that there's some issues with union as far as the police union as what information may end up in that file, maybe contradicting union regulations and contract negotiations with the city.
I see no interest or no conflict there in that issue.
Do you believe that the use of the KAS abbreviation was used to cover up some high-ranking officials or some city officials?
I could not speculate on a motive.
And who has to approve it to be put into that file?
The records department captain.
Who is that right now?
I believe it's Troy Livingston.
Do you know if the city has any plans for an external review of this sort of practice? And do you know if any other police departments in the state have the same sort of file?
I do not know how other law enforcement agencies conduct their filing system, and I am not aware of any further plans.
If the Kansas statute changes, will you do another review? If other governing laws come into effect?
Certainly, we're always reviewing, especially monitoring the record statutes. I'm not anticipating anything would change the need for a policy change on this system. It's consistent with records laws now, and but I would continue to monitor it.
I want to thank Jennifer for her review. The important takeaways for me are that we are going to develop a policy to make it clear on what records can be put into the limited access file and what can't. more importantly, to make it clear who is responsible for that designation, and that we don't use the internal limited access file as a mechanism to not share information with the public or with the media. And so that whole issue of known adult suspect, that's going to be cleared up in the policy. Actually, it's cleared up now, but will be cleared up in the new policy, as well as making sure that the media has access to the daily records that we have on incidents. And so all of that will be clarified in the policy. I'm going to ask Chief Ramsey to review that and implement it when he gets on board.
Bob, would you be open to a quarterly review so that things can be moved out if they don't need to be in there anymore?
Yeah, if that's necessary, I think what we want to do is maintain the transparency of the system and be able to show that it's fair in its administration. So if that takes quarterly reviews, maybe initially, I'm not opposed to that at all, Craig.
How quickly do you want to have this policy for these records?
Well, the department will start working on that, has actually started working on it already, and Jennifer's made some reference to some of the items that are included and will be clarified. Whether or not we'll be able to get it accomplished before the chief or after the chief arrives, I'm not sure. We'll at least do the preliminary work. I probably owe it to the new chief to take a look at the policy before it is distributed.
And Bob, going back to the cases in the confidential file that listed known suspect or known officer.
Right.
Were you aware that that was happening before all this came to light?
No, I was not. And again, I think it's a limited number of, what I understand from Jennifer, is it was used a limited number of times.
And did you know there was a limited access file?
It was brought to my attention at the end of last year. And then we had, I had talked to the department some about that, talked to the chief at that time, knew what the purpose of the file was, but then as there were continuing questions this year, that's when I asked Jennifer to look at the practice, and she's been working closely with the police department to be able to get access to all the records and then to be able to determine then what was going on in the file.
And Bob, when you realized that Chief Mosley was the known suspect in one of the cases, did you review that case further to determine whether or not that should have been in public, or should he have been named acting chief?
Right. I'm not sure that he had any, I know he had no control over that file and that designation. What I looked at, which I thought was more important, Deb, was how was that incident investigated and what came of that. And Jennifer could talk about that, but all of the cases, and that was the other thing she looked at, was where we had an employee in that file, was that person then, was that case handled like any other case would be? And in all cases it was, or they were, excuse me. So there was a full investigation of every case. So this was actually more of that issue of reporting and what's available to all of the employees of the police department.
At this point in time, are you guys planning on retroactively, determining if any of those cases still belong in the limited file and then releasing those, or are they all just going to stay in there?
I think that's a good question. That's an administrative process that could be looked at with the new leadership in terms of should they be maintained or should they be reviewed and discarded at some point.
Jennifer had mentioned that she cannot speculate as far as the motive for the
Right.
use of KAS.
Right.
Will that somehow be investigated if that was used in an improper way?
That's a good question. I will probably have more conversations with Jennifer and with the chief, probably Chief Ramsey as much as, because most of this focus is going forward. But I do want to know what went into those limited cases where a known adult suspect was placed on a file. And again, I think it was unclear how many people actually had control of those files in the early years and who could have put something into the limited access file. Again, that's all going to be cleared up, and we're going to have a single point of entry into the system going forward.
Do you know if there will be any repercussions or consequences?
I can't say at this point.
Do you guys know what percentage of the cases that are in the limited access files deal with employees and what percentage are outside investigation?
In terms of a year-by-year review, the numbers vary. I would say that if I were estimating, approximately a third or fourth of those cases every year would deal with, in some way, with a Wichita Police Department or city employee as a victim, witness, suspect, or other.
And I just have another question on the, like on the sheets, if you guys put a case into the limited access file, will we see it on this sheet? Like we see all the other cases?
It's my understanding that all cases are generated on this sheet. They are later then in the investigation, then later when reports are generated, photographs, lab, those investigative files are scanned, then they become put into the limited access database. But initially, it's my understanding that all cases are pulled into the systems, the Aegis software from which these are generated.
And Deb, that's a good question, because that's what we wanted to make sure would happen as part of this review and as part of the procedures going forward. I think that was part of the concern, is that people felt that that wasn't happening because of this designation.
And was it happening?
I think there was, I'll let Jennifer talk about that.
In a different software, crystal reporting software, as I understand, there was a 10-year-old computer code used, and it was the code was used to extract materials for the daily briefing, unrelated to the designation of limited access or confidential database. There were some code issues that were not extracting cases based on when they were cut or generated, and that is what has been fixed. But it was irrespective or not related to the fact that they were limited access.
So the Mosley case would have been on here?
Yes.